From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. We start off with our weekly update on the activity taking place in the livestock markets. Jim Robb, senior economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center, looks at the improvement in the cash-fed cattle trade, the USDA cold storage report, and USDA's monthly cattle on feed report, which was spot on with a pre-report estimate, something that doesn't happen all that often. Also, Brityne Rucker reports on the upcoming CattleTrace Industry Symposium being held November 22nd on the K-State campus. And Dickinson County 4-H Youth Development Agent Jill Martinson discusses an Ag Innovators Experience grant that allowed several youth to participate in a hands-on learning activity involving Native American bees. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
We're glad to have you tuned in for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network as we pick up on the latest from the cattle market scene now. And on the line with us from his office in Denver is the senior economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center. Again, that is a service co-sponsored by K-State and numerous other land-grant universities. Jim Robb with us. Jim, we're going to, in a moment, talk of another improvement in the cash-fed cattle trade this past week. Before we do so, just acknowledging that LMIC hosted an Agricultural Outlook Forum last week. Tell us what that was all about.
Well, it's a broad-based effort that we do every 6 months, Eric, and it's both crops and livestock. We covered the whole waterfront from macroeconomics to soybeans to dairy to cattle. Pretty intense. It's market analysts from universities, industry, and USDA, and about 80% of the audience are industry market analysts. So a lot of the topics were the ones we talk about all the time, and we continue to think about as economists and market analysts, from the China situation to trade policy to the macroeconomic environment and beef demand and all these things and how the puzzle's fitting together. It continues to be shifting sands, Eric, and that was kind of the tone of the meeting. There are some bright spots. We've been pleasantly surprised that we've been able to market at these prices the huge amounts of pork and the potential for international markets. And there's always a few downsides, and those tended to be mostly on the crop side in terms of prices received by producers, Eric.
Speaking of the cattle trade, the fed cattle market in the Central and Southern Plains picked up another couple of dollars last week, once more lending to this continuing trajectory to the upside.
And the futures markets have set the tone for that, Eric, and had a little bit of strength there, maybe not quite as much as the cash market. And that spilt over into the feeder cattle and calf markets. Kansas was slightly stronger this last week, and we're starting to build supplies a little bit. Oklahoma was down a little bit, but not unusual for this time of year. So the markets have held together and have, at least to a large extent, gone through the disruptions of the fire in early August, and the beef cutout was the underpinning to that stronger fed cattle market. The cutout for the week on the choice side, Eric, was up $5.15 per hundredweight. That's a very strong wholesale market move. The volume slipped a little bit from prior weeks, but not a big concern. But that undertone of higher wholesale meat markets certainly does set a pretty good foundation here from this point, maybe over the next several weeks.
Is that not unusual for wholesale beef to make that kind of firm move upward as we are now creeping ever closer to the holiday season where pork and poultry tend to rule the roost, so to say?
It is, Eric, but we had a very unique situation in terms of this has almost been what a market analyst would call a V bottom. We went down sharply, we've come back up sharply, and then now we're really trying to gain ground back on the anticipatory buy of the prime rib and the tenderloin for the holiday season. That had kind of been lagging. So we're kind of making up ground. So it is unusual, but we had an unusual decline going into this. So it's good that we've gotten back to these levels. These are the highest wholesale prices since the first week of September. and much higher than they were back in July and August. So the underpinning here in terms of the wholesale meat market, again, appears to be increasingly a solid foundation.
And if the trade can maintain these levels, even just as they are, that's a plus for the beef side of it, again, considering the holidays coming up.
Absolutely, Eric. And, we have the potential here for some buying going into the holidays, but a lot of pork, a lot of turkey, a lot of those types of products. We've been producing massive amounts of pork. This last week we produced about 5% more pork than a year ago and about 1% more beef. So there's lots of competition out there in the total meat environment, and we seem to have gone through that rather well. And as you said, that's a positive here as we look ahead. Packer margins are still very positive on the processing side of the cattle industry, and there's some room for them to continue to show interest in buying fed cattle.
Now, once again, the USDA also just released a cold storage report, and that probably reaffirms what you just said about plentiful supplies.
It did, Eric, but the surprises were that now cold storage is not as important. In the grains markets, we talk about stocks, and stocks are a real driver. Cold storage is a relatively small portion of the meat industries, but for some products it's important, but it does provide a bit of a barometer to how the industry is unfolding. As I mentioned, we produced in recent weeks 5 to 10% more pork almost every week, going back clear into the last quarter. But pork in cold storage only increased 1.6% for the quarter ending as of September 30th. That was much smaller than we anticipated as market analysts. So the pork built up, but to a much smaller extent than anticipated given the large slaughter levels. Beef in cold storage actually declined as of September 30th compared to a year ago by 8.5%. So we continue to move through the product much more aggressively. The market is absorbing more product than we anticipated. Similar story for chicken and turkey. Chicken with huge production levels, we still pulled down the cold stocks by 4.5%. That's a very significant drawdown compared to the levels that we had reached, which were becoming burdensome. And even turkey in cold storage, as we look ahead to holidays, was down 6.5%. So in the big picture of the meat market, this cold storage report, Eric, really reflects surprisingly good movement through the domestic, somewhat through the international marketplace, but much of this has moved through the domestic marketplace at higher prices and more aggressively than anticipated, which again, if we're not building up the frozen stocks, sets a tone for the markets to be rather in balance, positive sense, as we look ahead. So this cold storage report, we usually do not focus on it, but it probably is a bit of a good barometer for what has happened recently, which has been really surprisingly good meat movement and poultry movement in the overall marketplace.
The USDA also, this past Friday, put out its monthly Cattle on Feed report. And as those reports go, this was a pretty tame set of numbers unto itself.
And, they always aren't that way, Eric, but this one was spot on with the pre-report estimates. We haven't seen as close a report to the pre-report estimates in probably a couple of years. And it's difficult. We've had these disruptions in the marketplace. There's a lot of uncertainty on placements. But overall, the numbers came in 1% down, actually 1.1% down on the total October 1 inventory. Placements up 2%, which is right in line with anticipations, and marketing's up 1%. So this is a well-anticipated report, probably not one that makes much news. Now, the part of the report that we're focusing on is kind of hidden in the back, and it's the quarterly percentage of steers and heifers on feed. And those numbers were as anticipated also, but do tell an important story. The number of steers on feed as of October 1 in the U.S. 1,000 head and larger feedlots was down 222,000 head from a year ago. In percentage terms, Eric, that's a 3.1% decline in steers on feed. Heifers on feed, in contrast, were up 100,000 head, or up 2.3%. So we continue to have a lot of heifers that are in feedlots and have moved into feedlots recently, and fewer steers probably than anticipated. This may, in the big picture sense, if we step back, imply that USDA maybe slightly overestimated the size of the 2018, because there's a long lag in the biological process, the size of the calf crop. So this continues to also show that the cyclical adjustment towards now declining total beef cow herd is well in place as we get looking ahead to January 1, 2020. Mm-hmm. Just a brief review on the Kansas numbers were not a surprise, really. The Kansas on-feed numbers came in up about 1% year over year, and the placements were down slightly. And so the Kansas numbers really tracked with the national numbers. One more comment, Eric, as we look ahead, though, these placements have been very modest for the last 4 or 5 months. The industry analysts on balance in our recent meeting clearly indicated that the livestock market analysts expect October placements to be very large, probably a double-digit year-over-year increase. As we've worked through some of the situation with the fire, the grass conditions, and all these factors that tend to influence placements, and now we have a futures market that is giving us some better opportunities as we look at marketing these cattle in 2020, the placements have probably bunched up and are going to be bunched up here, especially in the October numbers and November numbers. And we could see quite a few more calves entering feed yards than we have the early calf flow into feed yards especially. So that's something to kind of keep in the back of one's mind, that these modest placements probably have a bit of a catch-up that goes on, especially in October and November.
One last thing here, if you look ahead to the trade for the next several days, how do you see the trends shaping up, Jim?
Well, with a very strong uptick in the wholesale beef market, certainly is some possibilities for some further increases in slaughter steer and heifer prices. And we got some of that last week, but there could be a little bit more ahead. Really will turn here on how the packers see the demand profile and how they then step forward and buy cattle. But I think there's some likelihood that there's rather modest downside potential in the fed cattle market over the next couple of weeks, and maybe some additional upside on the cash market, which is already largely reflected in futures prices.
Always great to talk about the positive tones in these markets. And Jim, for the input, we appreciate it very much. Many thanks.
It's been my pleasure, Eric.
He's a senior economist with the Livestock Marketing Information Center. That's Jim Robb. He's with us regularly to have a look at the cattle market trends here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Brityne Rucker. After nearly 2 years of planning, development, and implementation of a cattle disease traceability infrastructure, CattleTrace is inviting all beef industry stakeholders to attend the first ever CattleTrace Industry Symposium on November 22nd in Manhattan at the K-State Student Union. This event is an opportunity for industry stakeholders to provide important feedback about CattleTrace, while also continuing to chart the path forward for disease traceability in the beef industry. Joining me now is Cassie Kneibel, Program Manager, and Brandon Depenbusch, Chair of CattleTrace. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the symposium, Brandon, will you give me a brief history and background into CattleTrace?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us. Appreciate your listeners supporting us and for you allowing us to talk about CattleTrace. So we've been going on here for about 18 months, I would say, and it's an initiative that's been a partnership between private industry, the Department of Ag here in Kansas, and then Kansas Livestock Association to come together and build a disease traceability system for our industry. So we've been, up until this point, we've really had 3 objectives. The first one would be to build the infrastructure, build what the system looks like, and then to test the structure. So we're really kind of in that phase of the pilot project right now, is to test that infrastructure with the purpose of how quickly can we identify animals that are at risk that maybe show signs and symptoms of a disease, and then how quickly can we trace them back and identify them. So that's the second objective. The third objective is to evaluate the economics or evaluate how the whole system looks. So there's a lot of different components to that. Are there value-add opportunities? What's the cost of the system? And then who shares in some of that cost for that traceability system? So up until this point, we've had really a lot of momentum, a lot of excitement. So very thankful for the listeners out there who are supporters of what we're doing with CattleTrace. It's funny, CattleTrace was built for contagious diseases, but CattleTrace itself is becoming contagious, meaning that it's spreading to other parts, certainly of the state, but even into other states within the United States. So that's fun to see. We're fun to see a bunch of different partners from different areas coming together and support the vision that we have to build a national traceability system. One thing I think it's worth mentioning, there's only 2 beef exporting nations in the world that don't have a traceability system. U.S. is one, and then India. And India only exports water buffalo. So in a roundabout way, I like to say that we're the only beef exporting nation in the world that don't have some traceability system. Pretty much all those other countries in the nation that has a traceability system, they were forced into it. They had to react. Their governments had to react and build the traceability system pretty quickly and maybe even haphazardly in response to a disease outbreak. So in one respect, it's kind of embarrassing that the U.S. don't have a comprehensive traceability system. But in other respects, we're kind of fortunate from the standpoint an industry can build a traceability system built by industry for industry. So our vision really is to build this traceability system, a national traceability system, and then to be able to have that as what our system looks like, to be able to give it to USDA or whatever and say, here's what it is for producers.
Now, partnership, as you mentioned earlier, is a big element in CattleTrace.
So we've been very fortunate to have great partners throughout the state and now throughout the U.S. So we are in 12 livestock markets now in 4 different states. Our most recent one, we actually just announced OKC West in El Reno, Oklahoma. We have 2 backgrounders, 16 feed yards in 3 different states, and the 3 major packers in Kansas, and even that is starting to expand as well outside of Kansas. So we're really excited about growth. As Brandon mentioned, we wouldn't be where we are today without all of our partners, and so that's been very instrumental in growing the infrastructure and testing the infrastructure, but also getting input from producers. It's been pretty important to us. We want something that works in the industry and for the industry. And so we need the industry to actually figure that out. It's been probably one of the more exciting parts, I think, of the project for both of us is talking to those producers and those partners throughout the country, really. And we hope to continue to see that growth over the next 9 months of the pilot stage.
Now, you guys are growing exponentially. What has been some challenges associated with that?
There have been a few. I think one would probably be when we first installed readers at the packers. It was more challenging than the other segments of production of the production system, but we were able to work with a technical expert kind of in that UHF RFID technology, and they've been able to help us improve those tremendously. So that's been exciting to see, and we're continuing to test that phase. The other thing has been trying to be strategic with where we place our tags. We have a set number of tags. Actually, initially we started at 55,000 tags, but we rearranged our budget a little bit this summer, and now we have 90,000 tags. So just test the footprint a little bit more. What's been really pleasing to me is, I get calls all the time of folks who want to participate, and if their cattle are read at some point in the system, so they're going to walk by a reader at some point, whether it's at a sale barn or a feed yard or, the packer stage, then by all means, I say yes. But unfortunately, we don't have readers everywhere right now. And so that's been a challenge, is trying to figure out where to place tags and get the most reads in the system so we actually have data to test with.
Now, this industry symposium is really supposed to be the first kind of glimpse of the database in action.
Yes, so we're excited. The first ever CattleTrace Industry Symposium, as you said, is on November 22nd in Manhattan at the K-State Student Union. It is free to attend, and we invite kind of all industry interested in disease traceability for cattle and kind of how we build the system. We are going to have a few guest speakers. One gentleman, actually, we've been talking to him for over a year now, is from Scotland, actually, and so he is coming over to talk about One about how traceability started in their country. I think his presentation will be very interesting, talking about the history of traceability in their country and how they got to where they are today, what technology they're using. They've been using UHF or testing it for the past 6 or 7 years, and so he's going to talk about their experiences and what they've learned about it and why they're transitioning to UHF technology, which is what we chose to use for our project. We'll also kind of cover some of the economics. As Brandon mentioned, that's one of the objectives of our pilot, and looking at, as a producer, what's in it for me? Why do I need to participate in a traceability program? So what do those economics look like? As well as giving a glimpse of our database. And as the board, Brandon is the chair of the CattleTrace board, that's really where they spend a lot of their time, is figuring out how that data is accessed, who can access it, and what that looks like.
Yeah, that may be a good point to jump in on. As Cassie and I and the rest of our team goes around and talk to producers about CattleTrace and why to participate from that standpoint, the producers want to know why. That's probably the number one question. What's in it for me? Why should I participate? And really, it's to protect our export markets. One big area, in some respect, is to protect our export markets and the disease traceability, to be able to still access those export markets should we have a disease outbreak. So, yeah, back to Cassie's question regarding the demo that we're going to talk about at the CattleTrace Symposium, about being able to demo what that database looks like and how that looks, that traceback situation looks. The board of directors really sits in the middle as I see it. So we have a 6-member board of director, all producer-driven, all producers, that are charged with setting the policies and procedures for who, when, and how the data is accessed. So right now, CattleTrace is a privately owned database. CattleTrace Inc. is set up to be a 501c3 nonprofit company, and they own and control that database. And that's the important point for everybody to understand, is that if it was tied to a government, whether it be the state of Kansas or the federal government or even Kansas State University, it's at risk for Freedom of Information Act. So people can do a FOIA and be able to get in there and get access to producers' data that they don't want. So on the left hand, you really have the producers that they're comfortable with sharing their information in a disease outbreak. But other than that, they just want that to be kept private, and so do I. But on the right hand, you have the state animal health commissioners, or USDA, that some of them really want to be able to have access to that data all the time. So the board of directors sits right in the middle and be able to determine who, when, and how that data is accessed. So we are working through that process, and we're going to be seeking some feedback at this symposium from producers, other producers, to be able to help guide us as we make those decisions of who, when, and how that data is accessed, to be able to balance both the needs from a disease traceability standpoint, but then also to balance the privacy concerns of the producers. So when we go around, we talk to producers, they ask, why do we want to participate? This is their opportunity, as we say, to have a seat at the table, to be able to build what this national disease traceability system could look like. So we have other attempts when we go around and talk to producers, but this is an invitation to the industry to come and have a seat at a really big table and to be able to talk and give input of what that traceability system should look like.
And if producers do want to participate in this discussion at the symposium, where can they find more information?
If they go to our website, which is CattleTrace.org, you can register for the symposium there. Again, it's free to attend, and then there's other information regarding CattleTrace on our website as well.
Well, Cassie and Brandon, I appreciate you being here and discussing CattleTrace as well as the upcoming symposium here at K-State.
Thank you, Brityne.
Once again, that is Cassie Kneibel, Program Manager, and Brandon Depenbusch, Chair of CattleTrace. Once again, to register for the first ever CattleTrace Symposium, do so by November 7th at CattleTrace.org. I'm Brityne Rucker, and this is Agriculture Today. We'll return with more after this short break.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wichman. In today's agricultural news, are we about to enter a cattle herd contraction or not? Gary Crawford takes a look at that possibility.
Friday's Agriculture Department Cattle on Feed report.
It really doesn't have a big surprise from a market impact.
Darn. But USDA livestock analyst Shale Shagam says it does have
sex.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Basic numbers, October 1st feedlot inventory, 11.3 million head, 1% lower than 1 year ago. That's after September placements of just under 2.1 million head, up 2%. But now we get to the good part, the breakout by
sex.
Yeah, the October 1 feedlot inventory had 4.4 million heifer and heifer calves.
About 2% above a year ago, and the highest number of heifers on feed on October 1st since 2001.
Also, as a percentage of the entire feedlot inventory,
the number of heifer calves was about 39%, which is also a very, very high number.
So are we in a herd contraction phase or not? Shagam says
we're very much sort of at a tipping point.
A cow tipping point. Which way will it go?
It's going to depend largely on the availability of probably forage over the winter.
All right. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
According to agricultural officials, African swine fever is triggering nearly $20 million in losses a month in the Philippine hog industry. In a statement late last week, the Philippines government is urging a joint effort to manage, contain, and control the disease that is also wreaking havoc on hog industries in China and other Asian countries. The Philippines government reported the first ASF outbreak in September. Since then, more than 60,000 pigs have been culled in an effort to slow the spread of this highly contagious disease. That's less than 1% of the country's herd, estimated at 12.7 million pigs. Though the disease is not harmful to people, it is deadly to pigs. And with no vaccine available, this disease poses a major threat to the global protein industry. Meanwhile, the processed pork items were recently confiscated from a local traveler and tested positive for the virus. The tainted products include hot dogs, sausages, and cured meat. Agriculture Secretary William Darr pleaded with small backyard hog producers not to sell their ASF-infected hogs to traders, and for traders not to sell infected hogs to avoid spreading the ASF virus to other areas. Some provinces in central and southern Philippines have banned pork and pork-based products from the disease-struck regions. And now with this week's Milk Lines is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouck.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the sale of fluid milk in the United States during 2018. Actually, I'd like to go back all the way to 1975 and move forward to 2018 and just make you aware of some trends that we've seen in the fluid milk industry here in the United States. I think it's important that we consider these things as we look at how we position our farms in the future in terms of where we might be headed with raw milk. As we look at the data, one of the interesting things that we see is that the sale of fluid milk, or the amount of milk that we sell in the carton or in the bottle, has been actually fairly consistent up to about 2010. However, since 2010, we've seen a steady decline every year and actually have fallen off about 13% on the total pounds of milk that are marketed through fluid here in the United States. So that's on just the amount marketed. If you look at it on a per capita basis and you go back to 1975, moving forward through 2018, we've seen even a stronger decline on a per capita basis. Actually only seen a decline of about 35% since 1975. However, there are some bright spots as we look at the data. Most of you are aware that there's been a change in the thinking as to whether or not milk fat actually has negative health effects, and in many cases our health professionals are indicating that it might actually be better than some of the other fat choices that we might make. So as a result of that, in the last few years, we've actually seen a rebound in whole milk sales, actually on a total amount sold as well as on a per capita basis. We've seen some slight increases in whole milk sales. So that's a bright thing as we think about trying to move some of our product from the raw stage through the grocery store and also trying to move some milk fat to the consumer. So that seems to be very positive in what we're seeing in that part of the market. The other bright spot in our market has been flavored whole milk sales. Part of this probably is a result of some of the advertising and also some of the health benefits that have been associated with these types of products when it comes to sports and sports teams and rehydrating after sporting events. So in the last few years, we've actually seen an increase in the total amount of flavored whole milk sales going on here in the United States, as well as the per capita consumption of these types of products. As we look at the rest of the other types of fluid milk that we market here in the United States, actually total pounds as well as per capita pounds have been declining in the rest of the areas. So really the two bright spots that we see is an increase in whole milk sales, whether that be just in white milk or whether it be in the flavored whole milk sales area. So as a result, what does that mean for your dairy farm? Well, some positive things in that we are seeing a little bit of an increase in the sale of some of the fluid milk increases over the past few years. However, in general, the overall beverage milk is still down. So, as we look at how we're going to market raw milk in the future, will we be marketing more of it through fluid milk? Most likely not. So we're going to have to look to other products, whether it be cheese or soft products that we might be selling to consumers to increase our utilization of milk here in the United States. Outside of that, we'll obviously have to look at trying to increase the amount of milk that we can export, whether that be through dried products or other manufactured products to other countries to utilize the raw milk that we're currently producing here in the United States, and also to provide for expansion of our current dairy herd as well as production. This is Mike Brouck with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to think about how their raw milk will be used once it goes to the market, and celebrating that we do have some increases in a few areas of fluid milk sales here in the United States.
And that's a look at today's agricultural news. To listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net.
Protecting and preserving the nation's water supply is critical to our economic future and human health. Current irrigation trends could deplete 69% of the groundwater in the Ogallala Aquifer within 50 years. The top 8 Kansas counties for agricultural production are located in western Kansas, which overlies the aquifer. Those counties contribute about 1/3 of the total agricultural revenue for Kansas. Water is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing by contributing to the 50-year water policy process and advancing efficient irrigation and water monitoring systems for farm and home use. For more information, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back, and thanks for joining us on Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wichman. Kansas 4-H youth in Dickinson County, as well as the community at large, are benefiting from a grant that helps young people develop the skills needed to feed a growing world population. Ag Innovators Experience is a program that drives youth awareness of and interest in agriculture innovation and agriculture careers by tying relevant concepts to a hands-on activity that makes learning fun. Dickinson County 4-H Youth Development Agent Jill Martinson says that Kansas was one of 5 states to be awarded the grant. Jill, give me a little bit of background on this grant and how Dickinson County was fortunate enough to get this grant.
I think the original offer to us was because we thought that this program was focused on bees, and we have a special interest club in Dickinson County that's related to honeybees. And so I believe the initial offer to us was because we had heard that it was about bees, but it ended up that this was really focused on native bees for this year. So the Ag Innovator Experience this year was the Native Bee Challenge. And what we came to learn very quickly is that honeybees are not native to the Americas. So native bees, we needed to learn a lot more about bees that were not honeybees. And so that was one of the things that our kids quickly learned about and became really experts in, because there's not a lot of understanding about native bees or their importance. Lately, there's been kind of an interest in beekeeping and honeybees and the production of honey and the importance of bees. but realizing that native bees are actually much busier as pollinators than honeybees are, which is something that we learned as we were going through this project, is that, for example, mason bees, which are the really busy little bees that we see early in the spring when the fruit trees start to bloom, 2 mason bees can in one day do the work of 100 honeybees. Because we learned that honeybees are kind of divas and they don't like to come out when it rains and they kind of like to sleep until 10 in the morning. But mason bees are really focused. They don't have a hive structure. They're solitary bees, and so they really are working all day long for survival and in order to reproduce and in order to be really functional during their lifespan. And so it's really interesting the things that our kids were able to learn during the Native Bee Challenge.
I think what's interesting about this is they're picking something that youth are interested in to begin with, so it makes the science learning a little bit easier.
Right. And it was really exciting to see our youth become experts in a field and to really be able to share their knowledge of that. This grant program is sponsored by Bear Science, and so we were actually able to go to the Crop Science Center in Kansas City, Missouri. And so our youth went there and presented on this program. And it was fascinating in this, room full of scientists that our kids were the ones answering questions. And that was really an exciting experience to know that that's where their expertise had really developed to the point where they were able to offer. And they were asked, how can we improve our pollinator patch here at the Bear Science Crop Center? And to be able to have real input on that and to feel like they have that expertise and that they had also shared that expertise with a lot of youth throughout the state. That was a really exciting part of this program.
As part of this grant, they were able to go to Iowa State for their leadership training?
Yes, we had 3 youth that were chosen to be our representatives at Iowa State, and they were really the ones responsible for going and learning the information, learning about the program, learning about what they would be teaching. And then they were the ones who brought that back and taught 17 other young leaders in our county about how to teach this program. And then those 20 youth were able to do lots of individual teaching in lots of different settings, classrooms, water festivals, at our 4-H Discovery Days event, at the Insect Spectacular, which is a very special 4-H event that's held every year. But they were able to go to all of those different types of formats and audiences of young people and teach them about native bees. And so it was really a tremendous content learning opportunity as well as leadership opportunity for all 20 of our youth.
And really the total reach was almost 2,000 people.
Right. And that's counting a youth that we had reached, but we also had several adult audiences. It ended up that civic groups in our area said, wait, we want to know more about native bees. And so we're still getting calls about, can somebody come and teach us about native bees? So it really is an engaging project that our kids have been a part of.
Is this just a one-time shot then, or will you continue to work on this same focus area throughout the year?
There were a lot of materials provided with the grant, so there's still some outreach that we can do and still some materials that are, left where we can still share with more youth and other audiences. And then we also have kids who are trained and that are still young and within their 4-H careers that will be able to share this information more as it's requested.
What were some of the thoughts of the 3 youth that got to go and get this training? How did they react to it?
They were phenomenal because this was a huge responsibility that they took on. And they were very engaged in knowing that they needed to be the ones to have the information, that they would be teaching it. They structured the teaching experience for the 17 youth that they trained. They were also responsible for each trained leader had a box that they could take to a school and have everything that they needed to have to teach. So they had a kit. And so these 3 individuals took care of creating those boxes, getting the materials ready so that it was all, when the 17 others came to training, they had everything that they needed to have in order to present this program. So they took on a lot of personal responsibility, and 2 of them are currently in college and are training to be teachers. And so it was a point for them where they said, yes, this is absolutely what I want to do. And then our 3rd individual is really interested in entomology. And so it was, for him, a really deep content dive. So he was able to get a lot of content that he was really interested in and have a way to share that.
There's been a big push in the STEM area to try and get more people interested in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And this really ties in well with what 4-H is trying to do.
Yeah, so this is actually sponsored through National 4-H Council, and so there were 5 states awarded the grant to be able to teach it. And it is a really close look at science, but it's also science that's accessible to all of the youth audiences. So it's, looking at 3rd through 8th grade, having something available for that entire span to teach them about native bees that they will see in their everyday life, to know how to increase habitat for those native bees, how to increase food sources, and give them a real sense of what they could do to increase native bee populations. The third part of that challenge was then each youth that participated was able to create a bee nest, a native bee nest that they can then take home with them, have instructions about how to place it in their yard so that they could be part of the answer to having more pollinators, to having a better food supply, and to having better local food. So it really was a way to tie together the science with their everyday lives.
That's Dickinson County 4-H Youth Development Agent Jill Martinson. To learn more about the programs and opportunities available for youth, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.